They threw her into the street like she was nothing. Her brother's ledger torn from her hands, his evidence scattered in the Arizona dust. She'd ridden 300 miles to find out who murdered Thomas. She'd found the answer. And now, Marshall Tilson stood over her with his boot on her wrist, daring her to scream. She didn't scream. She looked him in the eye and said the name she'd found in the books. That was when he pulled back his boot and kicked her. Before we go further, if you're watching from anywhere in this country, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far Margaret Calloway's story travels. And if this story moves something in you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. Now let's go back to Red Rock, Arizona, 1873, where the truth was worth dying for, and one woman decided she'd rather die standing than live on her knees. The first thing Marshall Wade Tilson said to Margaret Calloway was that her brother had been clumsy. That was the word he used, clumsy. Said it the way a man says weather or taxes, like it was just a fact of the world, unremarkable and settled. Thomas Calloway had been clumsy, had stumbled in the dark behind the land office 3 weeks ago, had struck his head on the water trough, and that was the end of it. Tragic. These things happen to clumsy men. Maggie stood in the doorway of the marshal's office on the morning of her arrival and looked at Tilson across his desk and said nothing for a long moment. The ride from St. Louis had taken 11 days. She hadn't slept properly in 4. Her dress was dusty from the road, and her red hair was pinned back tight because she'd learned long ago that men took her more seriously when she looked like she wasn't trying to be looked at. Thomas wasn't clumsy, she said finally. Tilson leaned back in his chair. He was a broad man with a lawman's mustache and the particular kind of stillness that came from being the most dangerous person in every room he'd ever entered. "Ma'am," he said, "grief does things to how we remember people." "I'm not grieving right now, Marshall. I'm asking a question. Was there an inquest?" "Doc Hartley ruled accidental death." "Was there an inquest?" Something shifted behind Tilson's eyes. "Doc Hartley ruled." "I heard you the first time. I asked if there was a formal inquest, a record, witnesses sworn in, a proceeding." She set her traveling bag down on the chair beside his door and folded her hands in front of her. "I was a bookkeeper for Meridian Freight Company for 9 years, Marshall. I know what a proper record looks like, and I know what it looks like when one's been skipped." Tilson stood. He was taller than she'd expected, and he used the height deliberately, stepping around the desk and stopping a few feet from her. "Your brother's belongings were boxed up and held at the land office where he worked. You're welcome to collect them and be on your way. There's a stage back east Thursday morning." "I'll be staying a while?" "I wouldn't recommend it." "I didn't ask for a recommendation." She picked up her bag. "I'd like to see Thomas's office, please." He walked her to the land office himself, which she noted. A man with nothing to hide sent his deputy. A man with something to protect came in person. The land office was a narrow building, wedged between a dry goods store and a saddle shop on Red Rock's main street. Inside, a young clerk named Percy Holt watched Tilson walk in with a woman he didn't recognize and immediately began rearranging papers on his desk with the focused energy of someone who wanted to appear too busy to be questioned. "This is Thomas Calloway's sister," Tilson said. "She's here to collect his things." Percy nodded without looking up. "Box is in the back room. Got his personal effects, pocket watch, a Bible, some letters." "What about his work ledgers?" Maggie asked. Percy's hand stilled on the papers, just for a half second, but she caught it. "Ledgers belong to the office," he said. "Territorial property. My brother kept his own supplemental records. He wrote me about them specifically. A secondary accounting journal he maintained alongside the official books." She watched Percy's face the way she'd learned to watch numbers on a page, looking for the thing that didn't add up. He said he was keeping it at work because he didn't trust his boarding house room. "Don't know anything about that," Percy said. Tilson had his arms crossed. "Miss Calloway, I understand this is a difficult time." "Mrs. Calloway." The correction came quietly but precisely. "And I'd like to see the official ledgers as well, please. Land transfer records for the past 18 months. I have a right to review any documentation that may be relevant to the circumstances of my brother's death." "You have the right to collect his personal effects," Tilson said. "You do not have the right to go through territorial records. I have the right to request a formal review through the territorial court, and I will do exactly that if the documents aren't made available. I'd prefer to do this quietly and quickly, Marshal, but I'm not leaving Red Rock until I understand what happened to my brother." She held his gaze. "I have time. Do you—" Tilson was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that meant he'd made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion. "Percy," he said, "give Mrs. Calloway her brother's box." He left without another word. Percy brought the box. It held a pocket watch, 3 letters from Maggie herself, a Bible with Thomas's name written inside the cover in their mother's handwriting, and 1 boot with a broken heel. No journal, no ledger, no papers of any kind. Maggie held the broken boot for a moment. Thomas had been careful with his things. He'd grown up poor enough that he'd learned to mend his clothes and oil his boots, and treat every possession as if replacing it wasn't guaranteed. He wouldn't have kept a broken boot, not unless he'd meant to mend it and hadn't gotten the chance. She turned the boot over. The heel had been replaced recently. The leather was newer than the rest, and pried back off again clumsily, the nails bent and pulled. She pressed her thumb against the inside lining and felt the edge of paper before she saw it. She looked up at Percy. He was watching her with an expression halfway between fear and warning. She put the boot in her bag. She found a room at the Beacon House, the only boarding establishment in Red Rock run by a woman. Ruth Beacon was 60 years old, gray-haired, and had the unhurried movements of someone who'd decided a long time ago that most emergencies weren't. She showed Maggie to a room on the 2nd floor, set a pitcher of water on the stand, and stood in the doorway for a moment before she said anything. "You're Thomas's sister?" "Yes." "You look like him." Ruth said it without sentiment. Around the eyes. "Did you know him?" "He boarded here his first month in Red Rock, before he found that room above the bakery." Ruth's hands were quiet at her sides. "He was a good young man, polite, didn't drink, came down early for breakfast, and thanked me for it every morning, like I'd done him a personal favor." She paused. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Maggie set her bag on the bed. "Mrs. Beacon was anyone suspicious about how he died, anyone in town who asked questions." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "People in Red Rock don't ask questions about things that have Marshal Tilson's name attached to them." "Did his death have Tilson's name attached to it?" Another pause, longer this time. "I've got supper at 6, Ruth said. "You're welcome to join." She left before Maggie could ask anything else. That evening, Maggie sat at the small desk in her room, with the lining of her brother's boot carefully opened and a single folded sheet of paper spread in front of her. Thomas had written in the compressed, precise hand of a man trained in accounting the letters small to save paper, the numbers arranged in columns that were immediately legible to anyone who knew how to read a ledger. She knew how to read a ledger. What she read made her sit very still for a long time. The page listed 15 land parcels. Beside each parcel number was a recorded sale date, a recorded seller name, and a sale price. Thomas had drawn a second column beside each entry. In that second column were alternate dates, earlier dates in 3 cases by as much as 6 months, and beside several seller names, a single notation deceased prior to recorded sale date. She counted the parcels. 15 pieces of land, most of them small homesteads or water rights, all of them lying along a northeastern corridor that ran from the edge of Red Rock straight toward the mountains. All of them sold in the past 14 months. All of them now owned through a series of holding companies by the same ultimate buyer. She didn't have the name yet, but Thomas had written 2 words at the bottom of the page in letters slightly larger than the rest, underlined twice. She recognized the pressure of the pen, the same pressure he used as a child, when he wanted her to pay attention to something important. Follow the deed. The knock at her door came just after 9 o'clock. She folded the paper and tucked it into her corset before she answered. Two men stood in the hallway. Not Tilson, his deputy's younger men, the kind whose authority lived entirely in the badge and the gun, and the person who'd given them both. "Marshal wants to speak with you," the taller one said. "The marshal knows where to find me in the morning." "He wants to speak with you now, ma'am." "I'm sure he does." She didn't open the door any wider. "Tell him I'll be at his office at 8 o'clock. Good night." She closed the door. She heard them stand there for a moment, then leave. She sat back down at the desk and did not sleep. In the morning, she went to the land office before she went anywhere else. Percy Holt was alone when she arrived, and the expression on his face when she walked through the door told her everything she needed to know about what kind of night he'd had. His eyes were red at the edges. He hadn't shaved. He looked like a man who'd been arguing with himself for hours and hadn't won. "I need to see the deed records," she said. "Specifically the transfer records for parcels along the Creighton Ridge corridor, the past 14 months. "I can't show you those." "Percy." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the way she used to sit across from junior accountants at Meridian, when she needed them to understand something they didn't want to. "I've already found Thomas's notes. I know what he found. What I don't have yet is the name at the top of the chain." She watched his face. "You have it. You've had it this whole time. And you're terrified of it." Percy's throat moved. "If they find out I talked to you, they'll do to you what they did to Thomas." She said it plainly without drama, because she'd found that plainness worked better than pleading in moments like this. "I know. I understand that fear, Percy. It's a rational fear. But here's what I need you to think about. My brother kept those notes because he believed someone would eventually come looking. He kept them because he thought the truth was worth the risk." She paused. "Was he right? Or did he die for nothing?" Percy looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the back shelf and pulled a bound record book from between two others. He set it on the desk in front of her, open to a specific page, and put his finger on a name at the top of a column of entries. She read it. She looked up at him. "Senator Elias Croft," Percy said quietly, like the name itself was dangerous to say out loud. "He's been buying up the corridor land for 2 years. Slow at first, then faster. Whenever someone wouldn't sell, they'd either have an accident or a debt would come due that nobody knew about. Thomas figured out the deed dates were being falsified. Some of the sellers had already died by the time their signatures were recorded." He sat back down. His hands were shaking slightly. "Your brother came to me 3 weeks ago, told me what he'd found, told me he was going to take it to the federal land office in Tucson." He swallowed. 3 days later, he was dead. Maggie sat with that for a moment. Then she looked back at the record book and began reading. She was still reading when Tilson walked through the door an hour later. He took one look at the open record book, at Percy's expression, and at Maggie sitting with Thomas's notes and the official deed records spread side by side on the desk, and his face went very still. "Close that book," he said. "In a moment." She was copying numbers into a small notebook she'd brought in her bag. "I'd like to finish this column. Mrs. Calloway." His voice had shifted. It wasn't the patient paternalistic voice from the day before. It was something quieter and considerably more dangerous. "Close the book, right now." She looked up at him. "Thomas found 15 falsified deeds, Marshal. I've found 23. The corridor's bigger than he realized." She turned a page. "Senator Croft has been very thorough." The name landed in the room like a dropped stone. Percy flinched. Tilson went absolutely motionless for 1 second, then crossed the room in 3 strides and closed the record book himself, his hand flat on the cover, and looked down at her. "You are going to leave Red Rock," he said. "Today. I'll pay for your stage ticket myself." "That's kind of you." She capped her pen. "But I'm not finished." You don't seem to understand the position you're in." "I understand it precisely." She stood up, and she was shorter than him by a full foot and didn't care. A sitting territorial senator has been using falsified land deeds to steal homestead properties from families along a railroad corridor. At least one man is dead because he documented it. That man was my brother. She held up the notebook. "I have the records. I have the deed dates. I have the discrepancies, and I intend to take them to the federal court in Tucson." What happened next was fast. Tilson's hand shot out and closed around her wrist, and the notebook came out of her grip before she could tighten her fingers. She grabbed for it with her free hand, and for a moment they were struggling over it in the narrow space between the desk and the shelf, and then his elbow caught her across the jaw, and the world tilted sideways. She went into the corner of the desk, caught herself, and didn't go down, but the notebook was in his hand, and she was leaning against the desk, trying to remember which way was level. "Percy," Tilson said, "get the door." He dragged her out of the land office and into the main street of Red Rock with his hand on her upper arm, and she didn't scream because screaming felt like losing, and she wasn't ready to lose yet. She twisted against his grip, got a foot under herself, and for a moment almost broke free before he shoved her and she went down onto the street, hard, her palms and knees hitting the packed dirt, her vision going white at the edges. "This is the only warning you get," Tilson said above her. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. The street was not empty. It was mid-morning. People were moving on the boardwalks, and every one of them had stopped. "Collect your things from the Beacon House and be on the stage by noon. Next time I find you interfering in territorial business, I'll put you in a cell and hold you until you're old and nobody remembers your name." Maggie pushed herself up onto one hand. Her palms were bleeding. One knee was torn through her dress. She raised her eyes and looked at the faces watching from the storefronts and the boardwalks. A woman with a basket paused mid-step. Two men outside the saloon with their drinks in their hands, a shopkeeper in his doorway, and she saw the same thing in every face. They knew. They knew what Tilson was, knew what Croft was, knew what had happened to Thomas, and they were standing there in the morning light watching it happen again. "You all know," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Every one of you. You know what happened to my brother. You know what this man is." She pushed herself to her feet. Her knees screamed at her and she straightened anyway. "And you're all going to stand there and watch him do it again." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Tilson stepped forward. "That's far enough." The voice came from her left, low and level, with the particular weight of someone who wasn't raising it because they didn't need to. She turned her head. A man had stepped off the boardwalk and into the street. He was lean and tall, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, wearing a brown vest over a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. A hat pulled low over dark eyes. He stood about 15 feet away, with his thumbs hooked in his belt. Not near his gun, but not far from it either, and he was looking at Tilson the way a man looks at something he's seen before and has been tired of for a long time. "You want to step back, Hargrove," Tilson said. There was a note in his voice that hadn't been there a moment ago. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Consideration. "I want to know what this woman's crime is," the man said. "You threw her to the ground in the middle of the street. That requires a crime. This is territorial business. Then state the charge." He hadn't moved. His voice hadn't changed. "You're the law marshal. Act like it. What's the charge?" Tilson's jaw was tight. She was interfering with official records. "In the land office." "That's right. Land records are public documents." The man's eyes moved briefly to Maggie, taking in her bleeding palms and her torn dress, and the way she was standing, and then moved back to Tilson. "Anybody's got the right to review them. That's territorial law, not my opinion." "You don't know what you're walking into." "I know what I'm looking at." His voice was still quiet, but something had shifted under it, something harder. A woman bleeding in the street and a lawman standing over her. "I've seen that before. I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now." Tilson looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between the two men, a current of history that Maggie couldn't fully read, but felt clearly. Then Tilson looked at her, and the warning in his eyes was absolute. "Noon stage," he said, "or the next conversation we have will go differently." He turned and walked back toward his office, and the street slowly began to breathe again. The man came toward her. Up close, she could see the weathering in his face, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into sun, a scar along his jaw that had healed clean. His eyes were dark brown, steady, and they were looking at her with the kind of directness that didn't bother to perform anything. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." "Your knee says different." "My knee doesn't get a vote." She looked at him squarely. "I don't know you." "Daniel Hargrove. I do day work for the ranches south of town." He didn't extend his hand, perhaps aware that hers were bleeding. "You're Thomas Calloway's sister." The name hit her in the chest. "You knew Thomas." "Knew of him." He looked toward the land office, then back to her. "He came to me about 2 months before he died. Asked me to look into something. I told him I was the wrong man for it." His voice didn't change, but something behind it did something that tightened briefly and then went still. "I've been regretting that answer every day since." Maggie looked at him for a moment, this quiet, careful man, who'd stepped into the street when no one else had, who carried her brother's name with the weight of something unfinished. She had spent 11 days on the road and 4 sleepless nights building walls against exactly this kind of moment. The moment where someone offered help, and she had to decide whether the offer was genuine or another angle she hadn't seen yet. "Why did he come to you?" she asked. "Because I used to work for the railroads," Hargrove said. "As an investigator. I knew how land acquisition worked from the inside." He paused. "I knew how it worked when it was done illegally." "And you told him you were the wrong man?" "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her, and she saw something in his face that she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror more than once in the past 3 weeks. Guilt. Not the kind people performed to get forgiveness, but the real kind, the kind that settled into the lines of a person's face and stayed. "Because getting involved meant going up against people I used to work for," he said. "And I told myself I was done with that. Done with all of it." He looked away for a moment. "Your brother was 28 years old, and he went up against them alone because nobody would stand with him. I have to live with that." Maggie's hands were starting to sting in earnest now. She pressed them against her skirt. "I have Thomas's notes, a page he hid in his boot. I had the deed records for about 40 minutes before Tilson took my notebook." She watched Hargrove's face. "But I have a memory for numbers that would surprise you." Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful and more genuine than a smile. "I don't doubt it. Senator Croft, that's the name at the top. He's been building a land corridor northeast of town in advance of the railroad survey." She kept her voice low, even the same voice she used to present discrepancies to her employers at Meridian, factual and direct. 23 parcels at minimum. Some of the sellers died before the recorded sale dates. Someone is signing their names after the fact. Hargrove was very still. "You read all that in 40 minutes. I told you, I have a memory for numbers." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, Red Rock had resumed its business people moving past them on the street as though nothing had happened, which she was beginning to understand was the standard practice here. "You're not taking the noon stage," he said. "No." "Tilson's going to come back." "Yes." "And the next time he won't just push you down in the street." "I know." She held his gaze. "So I need to move faster than he does, and I can't do that alone." She paused. "You said you regret not helping my brother. I'm giving you the chance to do what you didn't do for him. But I need to know right now whether you mean it, because I don't have time for men who change their minds." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun was climbing, and the street was loud around them, with the ordinary sounds of a frontier town that had just watched a woman get thrown to the ground and done nothing about it. "The first thing we need to do," he said, "is get you somewhere Tilson's deputies aren't going to walk through the door. Can you get back to the Beacon House without that knee giving out?" "Yes." "Then let's go." He didn't offer his arm. He walked beside her, matching her pace close enough to catch her if she stumbled far enough to respect the distance. "And on the way, you're going to tell me every number you remember from those records. Every one. Because if they took your notebook, the only copy of Thomas's evidence is inside your head right now." Maggie looked straight ahead and walked. Her knee ached. Her palms were raw. Her jaw still rang faintly from Tilson's elbow. She started talking. Ruth Beacon set a basin of warm water on the table without being asked, and didn't say a word about the blood on Maggie's palms, or the man who'd followed her through the front door. She just looked at Daniel Hargrove the way a woman looks at someone she's been waiting to see do something useful, and then she went back to her kitchen. Maggie sat down and put her hands in the basin and let the sting of it clear her head. Hargrove pulled a chair to the other side of the table and sat with his forearms on his knees, listening while she talked. She told him everything she'd seen in those 40 minutes with the record book. Not approximately precisely. Parcel numbers, deed dates, recorded seller names, the discrepancy amounts. The names she'd cross-referenced against Thomas's notes from the boot lining. She talked the way she worked methodically, building from foundation to conclusion, and she watched Hargrove's face while she did it, the way his expression sharpened and stilled as the shape of it became clear. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You really do have a memory for numbers," he said. "Thomas used to say it was a gift and a curse. You remember every mistake you ever made." She lifted her hands from the basin. Ruth had appeared silently with a strip of clean cloth and disappeared again just as silently. "The corridor runs northeast. You know that land?" "I know it." Hargrove leaned back. "Creighton Ridge water rights. 3 homestead claims that went under in the drought 2 years ago. The Halverson family's grazing land. A mining claim that was abandoned after the vein played out." His jaw tightened. "Good land if you know a railroad is coming through. Worthless otherwise unless you're patient." Croft's been patient. 2 years of acquisition, mostly quiet, mostly through intermediaries. Percy Holt processes the paperwork, but I don't think he understands the full scope of it. He knows enough to be afraid, but not enough to be the architect. She wrapped her hands herself, not well, but well enough. The falsified deeds are the vulnerability. If even 3 of those sellers can be proven to have died before the recorded sale dates, the whole chain of title collapses. Croft loses the land and faces federal fraud charges. "And the sellers are dead," Hargrove said. "Which means the proof has to come from the records themselves. Death certificates, church burial records, letters." He looked at her steadily. "That's a lot of paper to find in a town where the marshal works for the man you're investigating." "I know. Tilson will move on you again. Probably tonight." "I know that too." She looked at her wrapped hands. "What I need is to get word to the federal land office in Tucson before he does. If the federal court issues a hold on the deed records, Croft can't have them altered or destroyed while the investigation is pending." She looked up. "Thomas was going to Tucson. He never made it. I need to know if there's a way to get a rider there that Tilson won't intercept." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it the way a man does when he's lived in a place long enough to know its geography of loyalty and fear. "There's a cattle drive going south out of the Rafter Tea Ranch tomorrow morning," he said finally. "Heading to Tucson for the stockyards. 12 men, legitimate business too many for Tilson to stop on the road without cause." He paused. "I know the trail boss. He owes me a conversation. Can you get a letter through with them?" "I can try." Maggie nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out the page from Thomas's boot lining, unfolded it carefully, and set it on the table between them. Hargrove looked at it for a long moment without touching it. She watched his face and saw the moment it hit him, not the data, but the handwriting, the small, compressed letters of a young man who'd believed the truth was worth documenting. He was meticulous, Hargrove said quietly. He learned it from our father, ran a dry goods store in Ohio. Every penny accounted for, every transaction recorded. He used to tell us that an honest ledger was the closest thing to justice a working man could get. She folded the page again. Thomas believed that. Believed if he documented everything carefully enough, the truth would have to be acknowledged. He wasn't wrong, Hargrove said. He was just alone. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Ruth came through from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and set them down without comment. Maggie curled her wrapped hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it work up through her palms. Across the table, Hargrove picked up his cup and didn't drink it, just held it, looking at Thomas's folded page. "Why did you leave railroad work?" Maggie asked. He looked up. "You said you knew how land acquisition worked from the inside. That means you were part of it." She kept her voice even, not accusing, just direct. "I need to know who you were before you were a man who does day work for South County ranches." He set the cup down. "I was an investigator for Continental Railway Holdings for 6 years. Before that, Pinkerton for 2. He said it the way a man says something he stopped being ashamed of and started just being honest about. My job was to clear land corridors. Sometimes that meant finding legal pressure, unpaid taxes, disputed title claims. Sometimes it meant finding other kinds of pressure. Did you know men got hurt? Yes. Did you do it yourself? Not the physical part, but I built the case that let other men do it and call it legal." He looked at her steadily. "There's not much difference between the man who pulls the trigger and the man who loads the gun and hands it over." Maggie absorbed this. "Why did you stop?" "A family in New Mexico. Father, mother, 2 daughters under 10. They had a homestead claim on land Continental wanted for a water access route. I found a technical error in their original filing, brought it to my supervisor. 3 weeks later they were gone, house empty, claim relinquished." He was quiet for a moment. "I asked my supervisor what had happened to them. He said they'd decided to move on. I knew that wasn't true, but I wrote it in my report anyway." He looked at his hands. "I quit the next month. Told myself that was enough, that walking away made it right." "But Thomas came to you," Maggie said, "and you told him no." "Yes, because walking away was only enough until someone asked you to walk back. He didn't answer, which was answer enough." Maggie drank her coffee. Outside on the street, she could hear Red Rock going about its morning horses and boots, and the particular percussion of a frontier town that had decided yesterday's trouble was somebody else's yesterday. She thought about Thomas coming to this man with his careful notes and his belief in the power of honest ledgers, and she thought about what it must have cost him to hear the word no from the one person in Red Rock who understood exactly what he'd found. "I'm not asking you to make up for Thomas," she said finally. "I'm not asking you to carry that. What happened to him is on the people who killed him, not on every person who didn't stop it." She met his eyes. "But I am asking you to help me finish what he started. Not for him. For the families whose land was stolen. For the families where there's still time." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was working through something she couldn't fully see, an internal reckoning of the kind that didn't perform itself for an audience. "All right," he said. It came out quiet and certain, the kind of all right that didn't come with conditions or hedging. "Then we start tonight." Before she could respond, the front door of the Beacon House opened and Percy Holt walked in. He looked like a man who'd run several blocks and then stopped outside the door for 5 minutes, arguing with himself about whether to knock. His hat was in his hands and he was turning it in circles, and when he saw Hargrove sitting at the table, his step faltered. "I heard you went to the rafter tea," Percy said to Hargrove, then corrected himself. "No. I heard she went to the rafter tea. I mean, I followed her here." He stopped. "I'm not making sense." "Sit down," Maggie said. He sat. Tilson told you to watch me, she said. Percy's turning hat went still. He told me to report if you made contact with anyone. And you're reporting by coming here yourself. Percy set the hat on the table. He's going to destroy the records, he said. Today. This afternoon. He came back to the office after he left you in the street, and he told me to pull the deed transfer files for the Creighton Ridge corridor and box them. He said there was a clerical review and they needed to be held off-site. He looked at Maggie. There's no clerical review. I've worked in that office for 3 years. There's no review. He's going to burn them. Maggie was on her feet before Percy finished the sentence. Hargrove was already standing. How long? She asked. I don't know. He said this afternoon. He might have already started. Hargrove looked at her. If the official records are destroyed, your testimony about what you read becomes the only documentation left. A woman's memory against a senator and a territorial marshal. His voice was flat and factual, not cruel. That's not enough for a federal court. I know. She was already thinking. Percy, those records, how many volumes? How are they organized? 3 bound volumes, transfer records, title abstracts, and the payment ledgers. They're kept on the east wall of the back room. Is there any copy, any duplicate filing that would have been sent to the territorial capital? Percy hesitated. There's supposed to be a duplicate quarterly report sent to the governor's land office in Prescott. But I've been the one preparing those reports for the past year and a half. He stopped. His face went through something complicated. Tilson told me to hold the duplicates. Said there was a backlog at the Capitol, and it wasn't necessary. I have 18 months of quarterly reports sitting in my desk drawer. The room was very quiet. Maggie looked at him. Percy, those reports are territorial government documents. If Tilson instructed you to withhold them, that's obstruction of official records. You have committed no crime by following his orders. But if you hand those reports to a federal officer voluntarily before the originals are destroyed, you become a witness and not a party. She kept her voice steady. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Percy swallowed. He'll know it was me. Yes. He could have me arrested. He could. Percy stopped. His hands were very still on the table now, no longer twisting the hat. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he'd been looking at for a long time, and had kept finding reasons not to jump. He could do the same things to you he did to Thomas, Maggie said. She said it quietly without softening it, because Percy deserved the truth, and because false comfort was a kind of disrespect. That's real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Percy looked at her. Your brother came to me too, you know. Before he went to Hargrove, he asked me if I'd help him. His voice had gone very quiet. I told him I had a mother in Kansas City who depended on my wages. I told him I couldn't afford to lose my position. He looked down. I've thought about that every day since they found him. Then you know what you need to do, Maggie said. The silence stretched. Outside, a horse went by at a trot. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. Percy stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at both of them, and then he looked at the door, and then he looked at neither of them, just the middle distance that people look at when they're deciding who they want to be. I'll get the reports, he said. Give me 1 hour. After he left, Hargrove looked at her. You trust him? No, she said. But I believe him. There's a difference. Hargrove almost smiled. It was the same almost smile from the street, something too honest to be a performance and too restrained to be comfortable. We need somewhere to keep whatever he brings. Somewhere that isn't here. Somewhere Tilson's men won't look first. Ruth, Maggie said. They both looked toward the kitchen doorway. Ruth Beacon was standing in it with a dish towel in her hands and the expression of a woman who had been listening for the past 20 minutes and had made a decision. There's a floor panel under the back bedroom wardrobe, she said. Been there since my husband built this house. He was a careful man who believed in having options. She looked at Maggie. Your brother had supper at my table twice a week for a month. He talked about you, said you were the smartest person he'd ever known, and he wished he'd told you more often. She turned back to the kitchen. Supper's at 6. You're both staying. Hargrove waited until she was gone. Then he looked at Maggie, and she looked at him, and between them was the particular quiet of two people who have just agreed to something that cannot be undone. When Tilson realizes the quarterly reports are missing, she said, he'll know Percy took them, and he'll know Percy brought them here. Yes. Which means we need the Tucson rider on the road before that happens. I'll go to the rafter tea tonight. Hargrove stood. Trail boss leaves before dawn. If I ride out now, I can be back before Percy returns. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she recognized from the street, not pity, not chivalry, something more direct than both of those. Accountability. The look of a man paying a debt he owed. Don't let Percy leave those reports anywhere but Ruth's floor panel. And don't open the door after dark for anyone except me. I've been managing on my own for 11 days, Maggie said. I know. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I'm not saying you need me to manage. I'm saying I don't want to come back and find you've had to manage something that could have been prevented. He paused with his hand on the door. Your brother believed someone would come. He hid those notes because he believed that. Don't let the thing he believed in be wrong. He left before she could answer. Maggie sat alone at Ruth's table, with the coffee going cold in front of her, and Thomas's page folded in her corset, and her hands wrapped in borrowed cloth, and she thought about her brother sitting in this same room 2 months ago, talking about her to a woman who made supper and listened and remembered. She thought about the 18 months of quarterly reports sitting in Percy Holt's desk drawer, the paper trail that Thomas had never known existed, the evidence he'd died without knowing was 1 room away from him the whole time. She pressed her wrapped hands flat on the table and made herself breathe. There was a shape to this now. The Tucson letter. The quarterly reports, Percy's testimony, her own reconstruction of the deed records separately. Each piece was vulnerable. Together, in front of a federal judge, they were something else entirely. She needed them all to hold. She needed one night. She reached for Ruth's dish towel, wiped the basin clean, and began writing from memory on the only paper she had, the blank back of Thomas's page, in the compressed, precise hand her father had taught them both, every parcel number she could still see clearly when she closed her eyes. She wrote until her hands hurt too much to write more. Then she kept writing. Percy came back in 53 minutes. Maggie knew because she'd been counting. She'd finished writing everything she could remember from the deed records, turned the page over, and started again on a second sheet Ruth had found in a kitchen drawer, and she'd been tracking time, the way she tracked numbers automatically, without deciding to the way her mind had always worked when it needed something to hold on to. Percy came through the back door instead of the front, which told her he'd been thinking on the walk over. He had a canvas satchel over his shoulder that sat heavy against his hip, and his face had the particular calm of someone who'd made a decision so large it had burned through fear into something quieter on the other side. He set the satchel on the table. 18 months, he said. Quarterly reports. Every parcel transaction in the Creighton Ridge corridor. Every payment recorded. Every transfer dated. He looked at Maggie's pages of handwritten numbers spread across the table and was quiet for a moment. You weren't exaggerating about your memory. No. She pulled the satchel toward her and opened it. The reports were bound in the pale blue covers that territorial offices used, each one dated in the upper right corner, each one stamped with the land office seal. Her hands moved through them quickly, checking dates, checking sequence, checking that nothing was missing from the run. Tilson came back to the office while I was getting them, Percy said. He sat down heavily. He went straight to the back room. I heard him checking the shelf. I was in the privy corridor with the satchel already on my shoulder. He pressed his hand flat on the table. He's going to know by sundown. Where did you tell him you were going? I didn't tell him anything. I walked out while he was in the back. Percy looked at her. I'm not going back there. Maggie looked up from the reports. Percy, I need you to listen to me carefully. These documents prove the corridor transactions, but the falsified signatures on the deeds are what prove the fraud directly, and those records are in Tilson's hands. Without the original deed books, we have incomplete evidence of a pattern, but not direct proof of forgery. She watched his face. Are there any other copies of the deed transfer records, anything filed separately, anything you made yourself? Percy was quiet for a moment. About 8 months ago, Thomas asked me to teach him the recording process, said he wanted to understand how deeds moved through the system. I showed him everything intake verification, the abstract process. He stopped. He spent 3 weeks asking questions, very specific questions about cross-referencing signatures and dates. Another pause. I thought he was just thorough. He was thorough about everything. Percy. He made abstracts, Percy said. Transaction summaries. For his own education, he told me. I showed him how to prepare them, and he practiced on real files. His voice had gone slower, like he was hearing himself say something he hadn't fully understood before. He would have had to use the actual deed books to do it, which means he would have had access to the signature pages, which means he could have copied them, Maggie said. The signatures, the dates. She was already thinking. Where did he do this work at the office? He did the practice work at the office, but Thomas always took notes home, said he thought better in the quiet. Percy looked at her. His boarding room above the bakery. Did anyone search it after he died? Tilson's men cleared it out, Maggie said. Ruth told me yesterday. Said they came the morning after Thomas was found and took 2 boxes. She thought about the broken boot, about Thomas hiding what mattered. What they found in those boxes is one question. What they missed is another. Ruth's voice came from the kitchen doorway. The bakery's closed on Wednesdays, she said with the tone of a woman sharing a piece of information she'd been holding until the right moment. Has been for 2 years, ever since old Garfield's back gave out. He lives with his daughter on Creek Road. The rooms above have been empty since Thomas. Maggie looked at her. Garfield gave Thomas a spare key when he moved in, Ruth said. Thomas gave me a copy in case of emergency, said he didn't have family close enough to call and wanted someone to know. She reached into her apron pocket and set a brass key on the table. I'd call this an emergency. Maggie picked up the key. She was already calculating the bakery was 3 buildings west of the land office, which meant 3 buildings from wherever Tilson currently was. The room had been searched once and cleared, which meant anyone watching it would consider it already handled. The risk was in the open street between here and there. She looked at the key in her wrapped hand and thought about Thomas climbing those stairs every evening with his careful notes and his compressed handwriting and his belief that truth, properly documented, had to mean something. She thought about the broken boot. Thomas had learned to hide things in plain sight in objects that looked cleared and accounted for. A boot with a replaced heel. A room that had already been searched. I need to go tonight, she said. After dark. You'll go with Hargrove when he gets back, Ruth said. It wasn't a suggestion. As if answering his name, the back door opened and Hargrove came through it. He looked at Percy at the satchel at Maggie's pages of reconstructed records and took in the situation in the way he had of absorbing information quickly and not commenting on it until he'd finished absorbing. Riders arranged, he said. Trail boss leaves at 4 in the morning. He'll carry a sealed letter to the federal land office and wait for a written response before the drive moves on. He looked at Maggie. You need to write it tonight. Official language, specific charges, specific parcel numbers, request for a hold on all deed transfer records in Red Rock, pending federal review. I know how to write a formal complaint, she said. I know you do. He looked at the satchel. Those the quarterly reports. 18 months. Hargrove sat down. He pulled the top report from the satchel and opened it and read for about 90 seconds, and Maggie watched his face go through the same sequence hers had gone through in the land office that morning. Recognition, then the particular cold clarity that came after recognition, settled. He's thorough, Hargrove said quietly. Croft. This is methodical work. Years of it. The railroad survey changes everything, Maggie said. The moment that corridor land becomes confirmed right-of-way, those parcels are worth 10 times what Croft paid for them. He had to move fast and quiet, and when he couldn't move quiet, he moved permanently. She looked at Hargrove steadily. Thomas wasn't the first. I'd stake my career on it. There are other deaths in those records that look like accidents and aren't. How many? At least 3 sellers whose deed transfers I flagged. I need the death certificate records from the county clerk to confirm the dates, but if the pattern holds... She stopped. We're not just talking about land fraud. We're talking about a sitting territorial senator who has been ordering murders to clear a railroad corridor. She let that sit for a moment. Which is why Tilson will not stop at scaring me. We both understand that. The room was very quiet. Percy had gone pale. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway with her dish towel and her steady eyes and said nothing. Hargrove looked at Maggie. The bakery room, he said. She hadn't mentioned it. She looked at him. Thomas worked with Percy for 3 weeks on deed abstracts, he said. Thomas hid his most important notes in his boot. A man that careful with a room that had already been searched. He paused. Where did you say the key was? She held it up. After dark, he said. We go together. Percy stood abruptly. I should leave. If Tilson's looking for me, the last thing you need is me here. He picked up his hat, then set it down again, then picked it up. His hands weren't steady. I want to testify, he said, and it came out sounding like it surprised him. If it comes to a federal proceeding, I want to go on record. Everything I saw, everything Tilson told me to do with those duplicate reports. Everything. He looked at Maggie. Thomas deserved better than what I gave him. So did you this morning. He finally put his hat on. I'll be at the Halverson farm south of town. Owen Halverson Croft tried to buy his land twice, and he told them both times where to put the offer. He'll put me up. After he left, Hargrove looked at Maggie across the table. You believe him? More than I did an hour ago, she said. They ate supper at Ruth's table at 6 o'clock, as promised beans and cornbread and coffee, strong enough to hold a spoon upright, which Ruth served without commentary, and they ate without ceremony. The conversation was minimal and practical. Maggie drafted the federal complaint on the back of the quarterly report cover sheets, writing in the careful formal language she'd learned at Meridian, citing specific parcel numbers, specific discrepancy, dates the names of specific deceased sellers with their recorded sale dates. Hargrove read each section as she finished it and said nothing except once quietly. Add the names of Thomas's abstract work. If it exists in that room, the federal officers should know to look for it specifically. She added it. By 8 o'clock, the letter was written sealed with candle wax and addressed to the office of the Federal Land Commissioner, Tucson District. Hargrove tucked it inside his vest. By 9 o'clock, Red Rock's Main Street had gone to its nighttime version of quiet saloon noise, and the occasional horse the spaces between lit windows longer and darker. Maggie and Hargrove went out through Ruth's back door and moved along the alley behind the Main Street buildings, staying out of the lamplight that spilled from back windows. The bakery's back stairs were narrow, and the door at the top was locked. Maggie put the key in and turned it and felt the mechanism work, and the door opened into darkness that smelled of old flour and closed rooms and very faintly of ink. She stood still, just inside the doorway. Hargrove came in behind her and pulled the door mostly closed. He was here, she said quietly, not asking. The room had Thomas's quality of stillness, the particular orderliness of a person who arranged their space to match the arrangement of their mind. Don't light anything until we know what we're looking for, Hargrove said. His voice was very low. Tell me what you'd expect him to hide and where. Maggie thought about Thomas. Not the abstract version of him she'd been carrying since his letter stopped coming, but the actual person, the boy who'd hidden his Ohio quarter collection in a hollowed-out arithmetic book. The young man who'd learned their father's ledger system and added his own refinements. The accountant who'd replaced a boot heel and tucked one sheet of paper inside it and trusted that she would find it. He'd keep the most important things closest to the most ordinary things, she said. Hidden in what looks like it belongs. She moved carefully across the room. His work materials, paper, pen, ink, things the searchers would expect to see and dismiss. She found the ink bottle first on the small desk by the window, unremarkable. The pen beside it. A stack of blank sheets weighted down by a smooth river stone that was too ordinary to be meaningful, which meant it was probably very meaningful. She lifted the stone. Beneath it was a folded sheet identical to the one from his boot, except that this one was not one sheet, but many 8 pages folded together, covered on both sides in Thomas's compressed handwriting. She carried them to the faint light near the window and opened them, and what she saw made her breath leave her in a long, careful exhale. Deed abstracts. 14 of them. Each one meticulously prepared, each one recording the official deed language alongside Thomas's notations dates, compared signature characteristics, noted discrepancies, flagged in a separate column with the same double underline he'd used on the bottom of the first page, and attached to each abstract folded separately were hand-traced copies of the signature lines from the original deeds, detailed enough to show the difference between a living person's signature and a forgery prepared after their death. Thomas hadn't just documented the fraud. He'd built the evidentiary case. Hargrove had come to stand beside her. He looked at the pages for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, he knew what he was doing. He always knew what he was doing. Her voice was steadier than she expected. He just didn't have anyone to stand with him while he did it. She folded the pages carefully and tucked them into the inside pocket of her jacket against her ribs the way she'd carried his first page. Then she stood still for a moment in the dark of her dead brother's room, with 8 pages of his careful work against her heart, and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the grief, not yet, but the fierce, difficult thing underneath the grief, the thing that felt like pride and purpose, and the particular love that comes from being seen clearly by someone who is gone. "We need to go," Hargrove said. He said it gently. "I know." They went back the way they'd come through the alley, and they were 2 buildings from the Beacon House when the figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of them. Not Tilson. One of his deputies, the taller one from the night before. He had his hand on his gun, and his expression had the careful blankness of a man following orders he wasn't sure he agreed with. "Marshall wants to see you," he said to Maggie. "Both of you." "At this hour," Hargrove said. "Now." Hargrove looked at Maggie. She looked back at him, and in the fraction of a second, they'd had to know each other's judgment. She read his question clearly. The federal letter was still inside his vest. The abstracts were inside her jacket. The quarterly reports were under Ruth's floor panel. If Tilson took them in tonight, everything Thomas had built disappeared with them. "Tell the marshal I'll be at his office at 8 o'clock, Maggie said. "Ma'am, he wasn't asking." "I understand that." She looked at the deputy steadily. "And I'm telling you that I am a private citizen who has committed no crime, and unless you have a written arrest order signed by a territorial judge, you have no legal authority to compel me anywhere at this hour. If the marshal wants to speak with me, he knows where I'm staying, and he knows where his office is." She paused. "Now, are you going to let us pass, or are you going to put your hands on a woman in the street for the 2nd time today and hope nobody remembers it?" The deputy stood there for a long moment. His hand was still on his gun, but he hadn't drawn it, and something in his face was doing a complicated calculation between what he'd been told to do and what he was willing to be seen doing. He stepped aside. Maggie walked past him without hurrying. Hargrove walked half a step behind her and slightly to her left between her and the deputy's gun hand, and she noticed that without remarking on it. They didn't speak until they were inside Ruth's back door, with it bolted behind them. "He'll go back to Tilson," Hargrove said. "Yes. Tilson will come himself next time." "I know." Maggie put her hand over the inside pocket of her jacket and felt the pages there, Thomas's handwriting pressed against her ribs. But the letter goes with the trail boss at 4 in the morning. By the time Tilson moves on us, the federal complaint will be 6 hours down the Tucson road. She looked at Hargrove. He can still stop us, but he can't stop what's already moving. Hargrove looked at her for a moment with that steady, dark-eyed directness that she'd stopped finding unsettling somewhere between supper and the bakery stairs. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm terrified," she said. "But fear is just information. It tells you the stakes are real." She held his gaze. Thomas was afraid too. He hid those pages because he was afraid, but he hid them instead of burning them, which means the fear didn't win. She pressed her hand flat against her jacket. "I'm not going to let it win for me either." Ruth came out of the kitchen with 2 cups and set them on the table and looked at both of them with the expression she'd been wearing all evening. The expression of a woman who had been neutral for a very long time and had decided tonight that neutrality was another word for cowardice. "The floor panel's holding," she said, "and I've got my husband's rifle cleaned and loaded in the kitchen cabinet." She set down the coffee pot. "I've been in Red Rock for 30 years. I've watched Croft and men like him take what they wanted and call it business, and I've kept my head down and told myself it wasn't my fight." She looked at Maggie directly. "Your brother sat at my table and told me what he'd found. I told him to be careful." Her voice didn't waver, but something behind it did. "I should have said more than that." Maggie looked at this woman who had kept a key and a floor panel and a rifle and 30 years of accumulated observation, and she thought that the people who made things change were rarely the ones who planned to. "You said it now," Maggie told her. "That's what matters." The night settled around them, and the 3 of them sat with their coffee and their separate calculations, and somewhere in the dark of Red Rock Wade, Tilson was doing his own. Hargrove left at 3 in the morning. Maggie was awake when he went sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with Thomas's abstracts spread in front of her, reading them for the 4th time, not because she needed to, but because staying still felt impossible, and the pages were the closest thing she had to her brother's voice. She heard Hargrove moving quietly through the back room, heard him check the bolt on the door, heard the small sounds of a man making sure everything was as secure as he could make it before he walked away from it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He'd put on his coat and his hat, and he had the look of someone about to do something that required not thinking too hard about it first. "I'll be back before 6, he said. "I know." He looked at the pages spread on the table. "Don't open the door." "You've said that." "I know I have." He paused. "Your brother trusted you to find what he left. You found it. Whatever happens tonight, that already mattered." She looked up at him. In the low lamplight, his face was all hard angles and shadow, and the particular tiredness of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to put it down somewhere useful. She thought about what he'd told her, the family in New Mexico, the report he'd written that buried them, the word "no" he'd given Thomas. She thought about the fact that he was standing here at 3 in the morning, about to ride out in the dark to deliver a letter that could get him killed because he'd decided that this time the word would be different. "Be careful," she said. He nodded once and went out the back door, and she listened to his horse move out of the yard and down the alley and away. And then the night was quiet again, and she was alone with Ruth's rifle in the kitchen cabinet and Thomas's handwriting on the table. She read until 4. Then she folded the abstracts back into her jacket and put her hands flat on the table and made herself close her eyes. Not to sleep, just to think without the pages in front of her, pulling her attention back to the numbers. The shape of what they had was solid now. The federal letter was on the road to Tucson. The quarterly reports were under the floor. Thomas's abstracts were against her ribs. Percy was at the Halverson farm with 18 months of witnessed knowledge and the willingness, however newly arrived, to speak it. What they didn't have was time, because Tilson had known since last night that something had moved, and a man like Tilson didn't wait once he knew the ground was shifting under him. She was still thinking when she heard the horses. Not one. Several. Moving up the main street with the purposeful quiet of men who weren't trying to be silent so much as trying to be fast, and when she went to the front window and looked through the curtain, she counted 4 horses stopping in front of the Beacon House and 1 man dismounting who was not a deputy. Tilson himself. She had maybe 30 seconds. She crossed to the kitchen and took the quarterly reports from under the floor panel and split them half back under the floor, half into the space behind the loose stone in the chimney breast that Ruth had shown her yesterday, with the wordless efficiency of a woman who'd lived 30 years in a town run by dangerous men and had made practical arrangements accordingly. She had Thomas's abstracts on her person and couldn't be separated from them without a direct physical search. The floor panel she fitted back into place and slid the braided rug over it with her foot. She was back in her chair at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around an empty coffee cup, when the front door came open without a knock. Tilson walked through Ruth's sitting room and into the kitchen doorway, and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd expected to find something different and was recalculating. He'd expected fear, probably, or flight. What he found was a woman sitting at a kitchen table in the small hours of the morning, with the specific stillness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Ruth came down the stairs in her dressing gown. "Marshall?" she said from the bottom step, with 30 years of Red Rock in her voice. "You want to tell me why you came through my front door at 4 in the morning without so much as a knock? Stay out of this, Ruth. This is my house." Ruth's voice didn't rise. "You're in it without an invitation and without a warrant, which means you're trespassing, which is a crime even for a marshal. So you want to try that again with a little more courtesy, or do you want me to write down the time and the circumstances in the guest register I keep for exactly these occasions?" Tilson looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at Maggie. "Where's Hargrove?" "I don't know," Maggie said. It was technically true. She knew his direction and his purpose, but not his precise location, and she had always been careful about the technical truth. "He left here tonight." "People come and go from a boarding house, Marshal. That's generally how they function." Tilson came into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the table from her. 2 of his deputies were visible behind him in the doorway, the taller one from the alley, and a second man she hadn't seen before, broader and quieter, the kind of quiet that suggested practice rather than nature. "The deed records are gone," Tilson said. "The quarterly reports from Percy Holt's desk are gone. Percy Holt is gone." He looked at her steadily. "You've been busy for a woman with a torn knee and wrapped hands." "I've been sitting in this kitchen since supper." "Then you won't mind if we look around." "I mind considerably," Maggie said. "You're welcome to obtain a warrant from the territorial judge and come back during daylight hours. Until then, you have no legal authority to search a private residence, and we both know it." She held his gaze. "You've been invoking the law at me since yesterday morning, Marshal. It works in both directions." Tilson put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward, and she saw what was underneath the controlled exterior. For the first time, not anger, exactly something colder and more purposeful, a man calculating outcomes. "I'm going to tell you something plainly," he said, "because I think you're intelligent enough to hear plainly, and I'm done pretending this is a conversation about legal procedures." He kept his voice low, almost conversational. "Senator Croft has 3 attorneys in Tucson, and 2 federal judges who owe him favors. Whatever you think you've found, whatever letter you think you've sent, it will be handled before it becomes a problem. These things always are." He looked at her without blinking. "But the people who force the problem in the first place don't get handled quietly. They get handled permanently. Your brother found that out." The room went completely still. Maggie looked at him across the table and felt something clarify in her chest with a sharpness that was almost physical. He'd just told her. Not implied it, not circled it, said it directly in Ruth's kitchen with 2 witnesses, because he was past caring about the distinction between a threat and a confession. That meant he was past caring about witnesses. She kept her face neutral with an effort that cost her something. "You just told me my brother was murdered," she said. "I told you how things work. In front of witnesses." Tilson straightened up. He looked at Ruth standing at the foot of the stairs with her hands at her sides, and then at the deputies behind him. "Mrs. Beacon is going to have a hard time remembering this conversation clearly. Grief affects memory. She's going to be grieving in about 10 minutes. Ruth didn't move. Her face didn't change. But her hand had gone to the pocket of her dressing gown, and Maggie saw from her angle the shape of what was in it. Not the kitchen rifle, but something smaller, a Derringer old, but maintained the kind of weapon a woman kept when she'd spent 30 years deciding that the law was a courtesy and not a guarantee. "Don't," Maggie said quietly to Ruth. "Listen to her," Tilson said. "I'm talking to you," Maggie said to Tilson. "Not her." She stood up slowly with her wrapped hands visible and away from her body, and she looked at him straight. "There are 14 deed abstracts prepared in my brother's handwriting with traced copies of the forged signature lines currently in the possession of a federal rider on the Tucson Road. The quarterly reports documenting the corridor acquisitions have been split between 2 locations in this building and a third location I won't name." She watched his face carefully. "The federal complaint naming Senator Croft and yourself as parties to land fraud falsification of official records and the murder of Thomas Calloway was delivered to the trail boss of the Rafter T cattle drive at 4 this morning. He is currently approximately 1 hour south of Red Rock." She paused. "You cannot recover all of it. You may be able to stop some of it. But the moment you do anything to me or to anyone in this room, you become the story instead of the footnote. A marshal who silenced witnesses becomes the face of this. Croft's attorneys can't manage a dead woman's sister. They can only manage a quiet problem." Tilson looked at her for a long time. "You're bluffing," he said, but it came out a half-second too slow. "I'm an accountant, Marshal. I don't bluff. I present figures." She kept her voice level. "The figures don't favor you tonight." The quiet stretched. Behind Tilson, the broader deputy had shifted his weight, and she tracked the movement without looking directly at it the way she'd learned to track columns of numbers peripherally constantly. The taller deputy was very still. Then the back door opened. Hargrove came through it with his hat in his hand and mud on his boots and the specific look of a man who had heard enough of a conversation through a door to know exactly where it stood. He stopped 2 feet inside the doorway and looked at Tilson and the deputies, and then at Maggie. One quick look that asked a question and got an answer. And then he looked back at Tilson. "Letters on the road," he said. "Rider's an hour out, and he's got 3 men from the drive with him because I asked Owen Halverson to send company." He looked at Tilson without any particular expression. "Owen also has Percy Holt at his farm, and Percy has been writing since midnight. Everything he knows about the quarterly reports, about the instructions you gave him, about every conversation he witnessed in that land office going back 18 months. He paused. "Owen Halverson doesn't like Senator Croft. He told me that twice, and I believed him both times." Tilson's jaw worked. He looked between Hargrove and Maggie, and then back again, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation he'd been running since yesterday morning, the one where he weighed what he could control against what had already moved beyond controlling. "You've made a mistake," he said. "Maybe," Hargrove said. "But it's mine to make." The broader deputy stepped forward. "Marshal, we could—" "No." Tilson said it sharply. The deputy stopped. Tilson stood very still for a moment, and Maggie watched him do the thing that dangerous men do when they realize the ground has shifted, not accepting defeat, nothing so clean as that, but recalculating toward a new position. "This isn't over," he said to Maggie. "I know," she said. "But tonight it is." He left. Both deputies followed him, and the back door closed, and the front door closed, and the sound of horses moved away from the Beacon House, until it was swallowed by the dark and the quiet of Red Rock at 4 in the morning. Ruth let out a long, slow breath. She took the derringer out of her pocket and set it on the kitchen shelf with the careful movement of someone returning a thing to its proper place. "Coffee," she said in the voice of a woman who had decided that some moments required a practical response. Hargrove sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at Maggie, and she looked back at him, and the thing between them was different now than it had been 12 hours ago. Not larger exactly, but more settled, like something that had been uncertain, had been tested and held. "Percy's all right?" she asked. "Percy is writing like a man trying to outrun his own conscience," Hargrove said. "He'll have 40 pages by morning." He put his hat on the table. "The Halverson place is solid. Owen's got ranch hands he trusts, and he's been wanting a reason to push back against Croft for 2 years. He'll keep Percy safe." Ruth set coffee in front of both of them and sat down at the end of the table, which was the first time Maggie had seen her sit at her own table, and somehow that small thing said more about the night than anything else. "He admitted it," Maggie said quietly. "Tilson. He told me Thomas was murdered, not in so many words, but plainly enough." She looked at her coffee. "He said it because he expected to be able to silence everyone who heard it." She paused. "Ruth heard it." "I heard it," Ruth said. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were clear. "I heard every word." Hargrove looked at both of them, and then he looked at the table for a moment, and Maggie saw the thing she'd seen in his face outside the land office yesterday morning, the accountability, the reckoning, the grief underneath the practical exterior of a man who had made himself useful in order to be something other than just guilty. "Thomas came to me on a Tuesday," he said. He said it without preamble, without being asked. He brought 3 pages of notes. Very clean, very organized, everything sourced and cross-referenced. He sat across from me in the yard of the Rafter T where I was fixing fence, and he laid it out the way you'd lay out a business case, clear and careful. Hargrove turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I told him I was the wrong man. I told him I was done with that kind of work, and that he should find somebody with authority to take it to. I gave him 3 names in Tucson and told him to write letters." He was quiet for a moment. He said letters moved slow, and he was worried about the deed records being altered before they could be reviewed. He asked me to go with him to Tucson. I said no. Maggie listened to him say it. She didn't fill the silence. "He thanked me," Hargrove said, "for the names. He shook my hand, and he thanked me like I'd done him a favor." He set down the cup. He was dead 8 days later. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over Hargrove's for a moment, the brief, sure touch of a woman who had been absorbing other people's grief for 30 years and had learned that sometimes a hand was the only honest response. Maggie looked at this man who had carried her brother's Tuesday visit for 3 weeks like a stone in his chest, and she thought about what she'd said to Percy, that Thomas's death was on the people who killed him. She believed that. She believed it precisely. But she also understood that believing it precisely didn't mean the people who'd stood at the edges of the thing were free of it. They just carried a different weight. "He would have come to you anyway," she said to Hargrove. Not to comfort him. She wasn't sure she was capable of comfort tonight, but because it was true. Thomas always went back to the person he believed in, even when they said no the first time. He was stubborn that way. She looked at the abstracts folded inside her jacket, felt them press against her ribs. He went back to Percy twice. He went back to Ruth. He kept the notes instead of burning them. He hid them where I would find them. She looked at Hargrove steadily. He believed in the possibility of people even when they gave him reasons not to. That's who he was. Hargrove looked at her across the table, and she saw the thing in his face resolve into something cleaner, not healed but honest, which was more useful than healed anyway. "Then we don't waste what he built," he said. "No," she said, "we don't." The lamp burned low between them. Outside, Red Rock was quiet in the particular way of a town that has been holding its breath, and the night was beginning to thin at the eastern edge toward the gray that came before dawn, and in a few hours the trail boss with his letter and his 3 Halverson riders would be south enough that Tilson couldn't reach them without abandoning everything else, and in a few days, the federal land commissioner in Tucson would be reading Maggie's careful, precise figures and Thomas's meticulous abstracts and 18 months of quarterly reports that should have been filed and never were. Tilson had said it wasn't over. He was right about that. But Maggie Calloway sat in Ruth Beacon's kitchen with her brother's work against her heart, and a man across the table who had finally decided to be the person he should have been 3 weeks ago, and she understood something that Tilson didn't. Something that men who operated through fear and permanence almost never understood until it was too late. The truth properly documented had already moved. And it did not stop for marshals. Dawn came the way it always did in Arizona, without apology. Hard light breaking over the eastern ridge and flooding the valley before anyone was ready for it. Maggie hadn't slept. She didn't think Hargrove had either, though at some point he'd moved from the kitchen table to the chair by the front window, and when she looked at him in the early morning light, she saw a man keeping watch the way men did when they'd decided something was worth watching over. Ruth had gone up to her room around 5, not to sleep, but to dress, emerging an hour later in her good wool skirt, with her gray hair pinned back tight, and her expression set in a way that said she had decided who she was going to be today and wasn't open to discussion about it. By 7 o'clock, Red Rock was awake. By 7:30, Tilson had not come back, which Maggie understood was not reassurance. Men like Tilson didn't return to scenes they'd already lost. They repositioned. "He'll go to Croft," Hargrove said from the window. He'd been watching the street for an hour. "Send a wire to Prescott or Tucson, wherever Croft is right now. Tell him the situation has changed." "How long does that buy us?" "Depends on how fast Croft can move his lawyers." Hargrove turned from the window. "The federal land commissioner in Tucson received our letter this morning if the trail boss rode straight through. Response takes a day, maybe 2. What we need is for the hold on the deed records to be issued before Croft can file a countermotion through his connections." "Percy's testimony matters then," Maggie said. "A sitting federal officer taking direction from a senator, that's not a land dispute anymore. That's corruption at the territorial level. Different jurisdiction, different urgency." Ruth set bread on the table without comment, and they ate standing up because sitting felt wrong, felt like waiting, when what the moment required was moving. Hargrove looked at Maggie. "I need to go to the Halverson farm. Percy needs to know about last night, about what Tilson said in this kitchen. That needs to be in his written statement before the federal officers arrive while the words are still exact." He paused. "I don't want to leave you here." "Then don't," Maggie said. "I'm coming with you." He looked at her knee. "It held last night," she said. "It'll hold today." They rode out of Red Rock on the south road before 8 o'clock. Hargrove on his bay horse, and Maggie on the gray mare Ruth had kept in her small stable since her husband died, a solid, steady animal with no interest in drama. The morning was cold and bright, and the land opened up around them, brown grass and red rock, and the enormous Arizona sky pressing down on everything with the indifference of geography toward human trouble. Maggie rode with Thomas's abstracts inside her jacket, and the quarterly reports split between her saddlebag and Hargrove's wrapped in oilcloth against the chance of weather. She thought about the last time Thomas had ridden this road going south to the Rafter T, believing in the man at the other end of it. She thought about the Tuesday he'd described the fence he'd been fixing, the 3 pages laid out like a business case. "He admired you," she said. Hargrove looked at her. "Thomas, in his letters he mentioned you twice before he asked for your help. Said there was a man south of town who'd worked for the railroads and walked away from it, and he thought that took a kind of courage most people didn't have." She kept her eyes on the road. He was always looking for evidence that people could change direction, could decide to be different than what they'd been. It was the most optimistic thing about him, and the most dangerous thing about him. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He was right that it takes something to walk away. He was wrong that it's courage. Mostly it's just exhaustion. You get tired of who you're becoming and you stop. He paused. Courage would have been walking toward something instead of just stopping. You're walking toward something now. With considerable prompting. All the best decisions are made with considerable prompting, Maggie said. That's not weakness. That's how people work. They rode in silence for a while, the horses finding their rhythm together, and Maggie felt the strangeness of the moment, riding south through Arizona, beside a man she'd known for less than 2 days, carrying her dead brother's evidence toward something that could still go wrong in a dozen ways. She had spent 11 days on the road, building herself into the version of herself that could do this. The version that didn't need comfort or certainty, the version that ran on precision and forward motion. She was still that version. But somewhere between Ruth's kitchen table and this road, something had shifted in the way she held it. She didn't have to do it alone. That was the shift. Not that she needed help she'd been managing without it, but that help was available and real, and standing 1 horse length to her left and accepting that was not weakness. It was just arithmetic. 2 people with the same information and the same goal moved faster than one. The Halverson farm came into view around 9, a solid adobe house with good corrals and the look of land that had been fought for and kept. Owen Halverson met them in the yard, a big man in his 60s, with the sun-ruined face of someone who'd farmed desert land his whole life and had no complaints about it. He shook Hargrove's hand and looked at Maggie with the directness of a man who formed opinions quickly and trusted them. "Percy's been writing since I left him last night," Owen said. "Filled near 20 pages. My wife's been keeping him in coffee." He looked at both of them. "Tilson sent a man out here at dawn. I told him Percy wasn't here. He didn't believe me, but he didn't have the numbers to press it." He looked toward the barn. "He'll be back." "Not with a small number," Hargrove said. "No." Owen nodded once. "So we'd better move fast." Percy was at the kitchen table with a stack of pages and an ink-stained hand and the hollow eyes of someone who had not stopped writing long enough to register fatigue. He looked up when Maggie came through the door, and something in his expression shifted relief maybe, or the particular look of a person who has been doing a hard thing alone and is glad to see the person they were doing it for. "I wrote everything," he said. "Everything Tilson told me. Every instruction about withholding the duplicate reports. The names he mentioned, the attorneys, the arrangements in Tucson. The conversation I overheard 3 weeks before Thomas died between Tilson and a man I didn't recognize about a problem that needed to be resolved permanently." He looked at Maggie steadily. "I knew what that meant when I heard it. I told myself I wasn't certain, but I knew." "You know now," Maggie said. She sat across from him. "Tilson told me last night directly, in front of Ruth Beacon and Daniel Hargrove. He said Thomas was handled because he forced a problem." She kept her voice even. "I need you to add what I just told you to your statement. The exact words as I've given them, with the date, the time, the witnesses. A confession made in the presence of 3 people is a different category of evidence than a documented pattern." Percy picked up his pen. "Say it again," he said. Slowly. She said it again, word by word, and Percy wrote it the way Thomas had taught him, compressed, precise, every detail in its column. Owen's wife, a small quiet woman named Clara, who moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing difficult situations since before it was fashionable, appeared in the doorway. "Riders on the South Road," she said. 4 of them. Not from Red Rock." Everyone went still. Hargrove was at the window before Clara finished speaking. Maggie came up beside him. 4 riders moving at a steady pace, not the hard, urgent pace of men coming to cause trouble, but the deliberate pace of men with official purpose. They were still a quarter-mile out, but even at that distance, Maggie could see the difference in how they sat their horses, the particular straight-backed formality of federal officers. "The trail boss?" Hargrove said quietly. Maggie looked at him. He was supposed to deliver the letter and wait for a written response. He wasn't supposed to come back himself. Hargrove's eyes stayed on the riders. Unless whoever read the letter decided a written response wasn't sufficient. They waited in the yard as the riders came in. The man at the front was in his 40s, weathered and direct, wearing a plain coat with a federal badge pinned to it that caught the morning light. Behind him were two deputies, and to Maggie's recognition, the trail boss himself, a lean, sun-darkened man named Cal, who nodded at Hargrove with the satisfaction of someone who had completed a job and witnessed the result. The federal officer reined in and looked at Maggie. "Mrs. Margaret Calloway." "Yes." "Deputy Commissioner Aldrich, Federal Land Office, Tucson District." He dismounted. "I read your letter at 6 this morning. I've been in contact with the Territorial Attorney General's office since 7. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document with an official seal. "This is a federal hold order on all deed transfer records in the Red Rock Territorial Land Office. It also authorizes the collection of any related documents currently in private custody as evidence in a federal proceeding." He held it out to her. "We received additional information this morning from the Attorney General's office. Senator Croft is currently in Prescott. He filed an injunction 2 hours ago to block any federal review of the Red Rock land records." Maggie felt the ground shift. On what basis? Territorial jurisdiction. His attorneys are arguing the Federal Land Office has no standing to review territorial records without a governor's referral. Aldrich looked at her with the steady eyes of a man who had seen this particular move before. "Which means we have a narrow window before a territorial judge either grants or denies the injunction. If it's granted, the hold order becomes unenforceable until the jurisdictional question is resolved, which could take months." "How narrow a window?" Hargrove asked. "The injunction hearing is this afternoon in Prescott, 3 o'clock. Aldrich looked at the document in Maggie's hand. "If we can present the physical evidence and a sworn witness before that hearing, the Attorney General can argue the federal fraud statute supersedes the territorial jurisdiction question. The falsified deeds are federal documents. They involve federal land grants. That's our standing." Maggie turned to Percy, who had come out of the house and was standing behind her, with his 20 pages of written testimony, and his ink-stained hand, and his expression of a man who had been waiting for the precise moment when what he'd decided to do would be tested. "How far is Prescott?" she asked Aldrich. "Hard ride. 5 hours." She looked at the sun. It was just past 9. If they left now, rode hard stopped for nothing. She did the arithmetic automatically, the way her mind always worked when the numbers were urgent. "We can make it," she said. Hargrove was already moving toward the horses. Owen Halverson put together provisions in 10 minutes, hardtack dried meat, 2 canteens with the practical speed of a man who had spent his life responding to urgency. Clara Halverson brought out a second horse for Percy, a sturdy dun that looked like it could maintain a hard pace, and looked at her husband with the expression of a woman who had made peace with the fact that right action was rarely convenient. Percy mounted with the stiffness of a man who spent his days at a desk and understood he was about to be tested by a different set of demands. He had his 20 pages folded inside his coat, and the particular resolution of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had finally found the thing larger than the fear. They rode hard. Maggie had ridden long distances before the 11 days from St. Louis had settled her in the saddle in a way that made the gray mare feel like a familiar argument. But this was different. This was time measured in fractions, in the difference between a judge granting an injunction before they arrived and a judge waiting because the evidence was on the road and moving. She rode with Thomas's abstracts against her ribs and felt them with every stride of the horse, the way you feel something you've stopped being afraid of losing, because losing it is no longer the worst thing that could happen. Hargrove rode beside her and slightly ahead, reading the terrain, the way he read everything, with the quiet competence of a man who had spent years in hard country and learned to move through it without fighting it. Twice he adjusted their route without explaining why, and both times she saw the reason a quarter-mile later, a soft creek crossing that would have slowed them a ridge that cut 10 minutes off the approach. She filed this away, the way she filed numbers, as information that indicated a pattern, and the pattern it indicated was a man who was very good at the practical work of keeping people safe. She thought about what that cost him. what it had cost him to be that useful in the service of the wrong things, and what it meant that he had chosen slowly, reluctantly, with considerable prompting, as he'd said himself, to put that competence toward something different. They reached Prescott at 20 minutes past 2. The territorial courthouse was a stone building at the center of town, with the self-important solidity of official architecture everywhere. Aldrich led them in at a pace just short of running through a corridor of polished wood and official portraits, and Maggie registered the space without stopping to look at it. Her attention on the doors at the end of the hall, where a clerk in a dark coat was trying to tell them the hearing had already begun. "It started early," the clerk said. "Senator Croft's attorneys requested the judge advance the time. It's been running for 20 minutes. Aldrich showed his federal badge. "We have physical evidence material to this proceeding and a sworn witness. Interrupt the hearing." "Sir, I can't just—" "Interrupt the hearing," Aldrich said with the tone of a man for whom this was not the first time he'd had this conversation, and who had never yet lost it. The doors opened. The courtroom was smaller than Maggie expected, a working territorial court, rather than a ceremonial one, the judge. A thin man in his 60s with the focused impatience of someone who had been listening to attorneys for 40 minutes and was approaching his limit. On the left side sat two men in good suits, who had the particular grooming of lawyers who charged by the hour and knew it. On the right side was no one, because the proceeding had been filed as an administrative matter with no opposing counsel present, until now. The judge looked up. One of Croft's attorneys rose. "Your Honor, this hearing is in session." "It can remain in session," Aldrich said. He walked to the front of the room and set his federal hold order on the judge's bench. "Deputy Commissioner Aldrich, Federal Land Office, Tucson District. I apologize for the timing, Your Honor. I would not interrupt a proceeding if the matter weren't time critical." The judge looked at the hold order. He looked at Aldrich. He looked at the people who had come through the door behind him. Maggie Hargrove Percy, the two federal deputies, and Cal, the trail boss, who had apparently decided to see this through to its conclusion. "This is highly irregular," the judge said. "Yes, Your Honor," Aldrich agreed. "So is a sitting territorial senator falsifying federal land grant documents and ordering the murder of a territorial records clerk to cover it." The courtroom went very quiet. Croft's lead attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is an unsubstantiated allegation from a federal officer who has been asked to appear at the Attorney General's office this afternoon to explain his office's unauthorized interference in territorial matters. Mr. Denham," the judge said without raising his voice. "Sit down." Denham sat. The judge looked at Maggie. "You are?" "Margaret Calloway. I'm a professional bookkeeper from St. Louis, and I am the sister of Thomas Calloway, who was the territorial land records clerk in Red Rock, Arizona. He was killed 3 weeks ago." She stepped forward and reached into her jacket and brought out Thomas's abstracts. "These are deed transaction abstracts prepared by my brother in the weeks before his death. They document 14 falsified land transfers in the Creighton Ridge corridor, including traced copies of signatures recorded on deeds after the verified death dates of the listed sellers." She set them on the judge's bench beside Aldrich's hold order. "These are supported by 18 months of quarterly reports that were withheld from this court's jurisdiction by direct instruction of Red Rock Marshal Wade Tilson, who acknowledged to me last night in front of 2 witnesses that my brother was killed to prevent this documentation from reaching a federal proceeding." She stepped back. Her hands were completely steady. She noted that without surprise, because she had understood for the past 2 days that steadiness was not the absence of feeling, but the decision to be larger than the feeling, and she had made that decision standing over her brother's broken boot in a boarding house room, and had not walked it back since. Percy stepped forward. "Percy Holt, Territorial Land Records Clerk, Red Rock District. I have a written statement of 22 pages documenting the instructions I received from Marshal Tilson regarding the withholding of official duplicate records and accounting for every deed transaction in the Creighton Ridge corridor over the past 18 months. He set his pages on the bench. "I am prepared to testify under oath to the full contents of this statement." The judge looked at the growing stack of documents on his bench for a long moment. Then he looked at Croft's attorneys. "Mr. Denham," he said, "your client's injunction is denied. The federal hold order stands." He looked at Aldrich. "I am also issuing a referral to the Territorial Attorney General for a criminal proceeding in this matter." He picked up his pen. "I suggest you arrest Marshal Tilson before he decides to be somewhere else." Croft's attorney began to speak. The judge looked at him with the expression of a man who had seen 30 years of territorial law and had very little patience left for men who confused money with immunity. "Mr. Denham," he said, "I have a federal hold order, a sworn witness physical evidence of fraud, and a documented confession to obstruction of justice. Unless you have something of equivalent weight in that briefcase, I recommend you sit quietly while I write this referral, and then go find your client a very good criminal attorney." He paused. "You may step out if you prefer." Denham sat quietly. Maggie stood at the back of that courtroom in Prescott while the judge wrote and Aldrich signed, and Percy answered the clerk's questions in the steady voice of a man who had decided that the cost of speaking was something he could pay. And she felt the thing she had been carrying since the telegram arrived 11 days ago begin to shift in her chest. Not lift, it would never fully lift. Grief didn't work that way, and she knew better than to expect it, but change form. Become something with weight, but not without purpose. The kind of thing you carry, not because you can't put it down, but because putting it down would mean forgetting what it taught you about what mattered and what didn't. Hargrove came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He'd have been furious about the jurisdictional argument, Maggie said quietly. Thomas. He would have looked up every relevant precedent and prepared a written brief and stayed up all night making sure the citations were exact. She almost smiled. He trusted paper more than people. He always said a document didn't change its mind. He wasn't wrong, Hargrove said. No. She looked at the judge's bench at the neat stack of documents that had traveled from a dead man's boot lining to a territorial courthouse in 4 days through one woman with a memory for numbers and one man who had finally decided to stop standing at the edges of things. He trusted the documents, and the documents held. Aldrich came back to them as the clerk was gathering the filed papers. Tilson will be arrested today. The Attorney General is issuing the warrant within the hour. He looked at Maggie directly. Your brother built a strong case, Mrs. Calloway. What you've done with it, built a stronger one. He paused. Senator Croft's attorneys will fight. This will take time. But the foundation is solid. That's because of what you brought. That's because of what Thomas built, she said. I just carried it to where it needed to go. They rode back to Red Rock in the long afternoon light. Slower now, the urgency burned off and replaced by the particular quiet that came after a thing had been done and couldn't be undone. Percy rode beside Hargrove and talked in the loose, slightly disbelieving way of someone who had expected the day to go worse and was still adjusting to the fact that it hadn't. Cal, the trail boss, had turned south after the hearing back to his drive and his cattle and his uncomplicated relationship with distance, and Maggie found herself grateful for men who did exactly what they said they would and asked nothing about it. She and Hargrove fell back from the others, not by design, but by the natural gravity of two people who had more to say to each other than could be said in company. What will you do now? He asked, after this is settled. She thought about St. Louis, about her small apartment above the Meridian freight offices, her good desk, her orderly rows of ledgers, the work that had been enough before she'd understood what enough could cost when you applied it to the wrong things. She thought about the families in the Creighton Ridge corridor, the Halversons, the others, the names she'd read in Thomas's abstracts, people who had been told their land was gone and who might now be told something different. The restitution process will require someone to audit the corridor transactions, she said. Match every falsified transfer to its rightful owner. Trace the payment chain through Croft's holding companies. She looked at the road ahead. That's 18 months of complex records that need to be unwound carefully and precisely. It'll take someone who understands land accounting and won't be hurried or pressured by attorneys trying to minimize the settlements. She paused. I happen to know someone who will be between positions now that his employer has been arrested. Hargrove looked at her. Percy. Percy, under proper federal supervision, with someone experienced enough to keep the documentation clean. She met his eyes. I'll need a place to work from. An office, or at least a room with a decent desk. And I'll need someone who knows this territory and these people well enough to tell me when the numbers are telling me something about a real family and not just an abstract claim. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the cooling afternoon, and the light was going amber and long the way Arizona light went at the end of the day when it decided to be beautiful about leaving. I have a desk, he said. It's not much, but it's solid. I don't need much, Maggie said. I need solid. They rode into Red Rock as the sun touched the western ridge, and Ruth Beacon was standing on her front porch as they came up the street, arms crossed, and expression neutral in the way that meant she'd been watching for them for the past hour and was not going to admit it. When she saw Maggie's face, she unfolded her arms and went inside without a word. And by the time they'd put the horses up and come through the front door, there was food on the table, and the lamp was lit, and the Beacon house smelled of coffee and cornbread, and the particular warmth of a place that had decided to be a home. Percy ate with the appetite of a man who had forgotten to be hungry for several weeks and was making up for it. Owen Halverson had ridden in behind them and sat at the end of the table with his hat in his lap, and said very little, which Maggie was beginning to understand was his version of saying a great deal. Ruth moved between the table and the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman doing the work she'd always known how to do. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Maggie sat at a table and felt something other than urgency. After supper, after Percy had gone to the room Ruth had offered him, and Owen had ridden back south, and the house had gone quiet, Maggie sat on Ruth's front porch in the cooling dark and thought about Thomas. She thought about him the way she'd been afraid to let herself think about him since the telegram. Not as the problem she was solving, not as the evidence she was carrying, but as her brother. 28 years old and careful with his things, and grateful for breakfast, and stubborn enough to keep his notes, even when he was afraid, even when the people he trusted told him no, even when the whole town of Red Rock looked the other way. She let herself cry finally quietly because the urgency was gone now and the grief had been waiting patiently for its turn. Hargrove came out and sat beside her on the step, not close enough to intrude, close enough to be present, and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a while she said, "He was a good man." "Yes," Hargrove said. "He was. He deserved better than what this town gave him." "Yes," Hargrove said again. "He did. But he got what he believed in," Maggie said. "In the end, he believed the truth properly documented had to mean something, and it did. It meant Croft is facing a federal indictment, and Tilson is in a cell, and 15 families might get their land back." She looked at the dark street of Red Rock at the lamplight in the windows, and the horses at the hitching posts, and the ordinary surface of a town that had looked away and was going to have to decide going forward what kind of town it wanted to be. He got what he believed in. Hargrove looked at her. In the porch light his face was tired and honest, and without any of the performance that people put on when they wanted to be seen a certain way. "So did you," he said. She thought about that. She had come to Red Rock to find out who killed her brother. She had found out. She had done more than that. She had taken the case Thomas built in the dark and alone and afraid, and carried it into a courtroom and watched a federal judge sign a hold order and a referral, and the documents were in official custody now, and the truth was no longer a secret that lived only in a dead man's boot. She had done what Thomas had been trying to do. She had done it because he couldn't. That was not a small thing. She let herself know it was not a small thing. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I did." The night settled around them quiet and enormous, the way Arizona nights were, the sky crowded with stars that cared nothing for territorial courts or falsified deeds, or the small, fierce efforts of human beings trying to make the truth mean something. But caring nothing and meaning nothing were different things. And Maggie Calloway, bookkeeper, daughter of an Ohio dry goods man, sister of Thomas, who believed in honest ledgers and the possibility of people had spent 11 days on a hard road to prove the difference. She had proved it. The documents held. The truth moved. And the people who had tried to bury both of them were going to stand in front of a federal judge and answer for every falsified signature, every stolen parcel, every life ended to keep a corridor clean. Margaret Calloway had come to Red Rock to find out who killed her brother, and she had found something else, besides that justice was not something that happened to you or for you, but something you built line by line, number by number, with your hands and your memory, and the willingness to keep writing even when your hands hurt too much to write. Thomas had known that. He'd known it all along. She was just the one who'd carried his work home.